Differences makes a difference in teaching. 21st century school reform is all about quality teaching across differences. And these differences include culture, race, religion, family background, sexual orientation, gender, even different learning style that children bring in classroom. In today's news bulletin, I'm going to cover Dr. Gloria Ladson Billing groundbreaking work where she builds upon 8 exemplary teachers' best practices and coined the term Culturally Relevant Pedagogy. Stay tuned with me to find out more. Dr. Ladson Billing shared 3 equally important propositions for culturally relevant pedagogy. It's not about rote memorization. It involves challenging students' mind to improve their ability to think. Check out what 3 best practices she shared with us to enhance students' learning.
So in one of the classrooms of a teacher that I called Mrs. Valentine, the students were challenged to write using more vibrant adjectives in their work. And so Mrs. Valentine used her own emotional reaction to the students' writing to press her point. So when her 4th graders referred to a, quote, bad witch, Mrs. Valentine began imitating the famous scene in The Wizard of Oz, where the witch declares, "I'm melting." As she began shrinking, her students started shouting out more colorful adjectives: sinister, diabolical, despicable, to save Mrs. Valentine from destruction. In Ann Lewis's classroom, she promoted the student learning by asking thought-provoking questions. I observed the unit entitled, "Is Violence Ever Justified?", where students had to make sense of the positions that nations take to solve conflict or protect themselves versus what individuals do. Now, initially, students tried giving Anne what they thought she wanted by quickly responding, "No, violence is never justified." But she would not accept that pat answer. And by pointing out the instances of disputes that were common experiences in the students' lives, things like playground fights, and sibling battles, even gang violence, Anne was able to get the students to acknowledge that indeed there were times in their lives where they did think violence was justified. And then she pushed the students to consider alternatives to violence while understanding that issues of self-defense and national security they often create a belief that violence is sometimes justified. Finally, Margaret Rossi made a conscious decision to extend her students' learning beyond that of the mandated curriculum. Instead of the 6th grade mathematics book, Margaret scrounged for an Algebra 1 book to begin introducing her students to algebra and higher mathematics in 6th grade. And although students had to share the books because she couldn't find enough, Margaret wanted to encourage her students to think of themselves as mathematicians and to take on more challenging problem solving.
In these 3 examples, teachers were teaching for understanding, not for rote memorization. And textbooks were the supplement, not the determiners of curriculum. Lessons were highly interactive, where students contributing towards production of knowledge. The second proposition is cultural competence. The true cultural competence is the ability to help students grow in the knowledge and understanding of their own culture, while acquiring skills in at least one other culture. Let's see what 2 teachers' examples she shared with us who are implementing this cultural competence in their classrooms.
For a teacher that I call Pauline Hilliard, cultural competence meant embracing the student's language and using it as a vehicle for teaching American edited English. or what we often call standard English. So I call it American edited English, that English that we all use in formal settings. Because we all have an informal, you know. Pauline talked to the students about translating their language rather than correcting it. So she'd say, we might say, my mama, she'd be here at 9 o'clock. But the translation to a standard form, not the standard form, but a standard form, would be, my mother will be here at 9. So what you notice about these two ways, or did she ask the kids, what do you notice about the two ways of saying this? What is clear about this interaction is that Pauline understands the student's language. But second, Pauline recognizes that it is a language and that her job is to help the students become bilingual. Third, Pauline's students learn to code switch and regularly ask before an assignment if it needs to be in, quote, standard form. Pauline might say, well, you're working on a business letter, so yes, you need to write in a standard form. Or, it's your journal. You can use any form you choose. In the case of Gertrude Winston, cultural competence means having parents and communities regularly share in the life of the classroom. When Winston's 5th grade class was studying life among the early California European settlers, they discussed how people entertained themselves. Well, they asked Pauline about, well, what did people do? They didn't watch TV or didn't go to the movie. What were they doing? So she started talking to them about quilting bees. Quilting bees, asked the student. What's a quilting bee? And before long, Winston and the class were planning a simulated quilting bee, where the parents would come and make a quilt to be donated to a nearby homeless shelter. And Winston encouraged the parents to come with small children in tow because there were no babysitters and daycare centers in the 1850s. But it was a really interesting experience to just sort of be sitting there with these low to moderate income parents, sewing these quilts, little kids running around, other kids, the 5th graders trying to manage the kids. And
Socio-political consciousness. What this socio-political consciousness has to do in a classroom? We have students always ask us why we are learning this, and we keep telling them about the future. And we forget that students are living their life now, and they want to know how in democracy that learning is going to be useful for me, for my community, and society at large. Let's see how teachers are implementing this socio-political consciousness in their classrooms.
Good. And again, the teacher I called Ann Lewis was a good example of creating socio-political consciousness. When one of her students complained about how much he hated living in his community, Ann used his complaint as a catalyst for a broader community study. Rather than reinforce the notions of undesirability and escape from the community, Ann helped the students research the history of the community and recognize the changes that economic, social, and political conditions had brought it to its current state. And ultimately, Ann's work with the students helped them produce a land use plan for an abandoned strip mall that was in their community.
Check out below links to find out more about culturally relevant pedagogy. See you next week with more early years news, resources, and best practices. This is Arif Karidia signing off from This Week ECED Weekly News Bulletin. See you next week. Bye-bye.